Have you ever felt that something about your life isn't quite right? That beneath the surface of your daily routine lies a deeper reality you can sense but can't quite access? This feeling isn't just common, it's a recognition of something profound about the human condition. In 1999, the film The Matrix captivated audiences with its portrayal of humans living in a simulated reality, while their bodies were harvested for energy by intelligent machines. The movie's enduring appeal goes beyond its groundbreaking special effects and action sequences. It resonates because it metaphorically captures a truth many of us intuitively recognize. We are living in a kind of matrix ourselves, not one made of code and machines, but of conditioning, illusions, and limited perception. This matrix of life isn't a science fiction concept, but a practical reality that shapes your everyday experience. It's constructed from cultural programming, societal expectations, childhood conditioning, media influence, and the fundamental limitations of human perception. Like the characters in the film who mistake the simulation for reality, most people move through life unaware of the invisible forces that shape their thoughts, emotions, and choices. The consequences of remaining trapped in this matrix are profound. Many people experience a persistent sense of disconnection, living lives that look successful on the outside while feeling empty on the inside. They follow paths laid out by others, achieve goals that don't bring fulfillment, and eventually wonder why happiness remains elusive despite doing everything right. This matrix keeps us in loops of seeking external validation, chasing temporary pleasures, and postponing authentic living for some future date that never arrives. But just as in the film, there is a way out. This isn't about taking a red pill or dramatic physical escape. It's about a shift in consciousness that allows you to see beyond the illusions and live from a place of greater awareness and authenticity. This awakening doesn't require abandoning your current life, but transforming your relationship to it. It's about recognizing the matrix while still operating within it, but with newfound freedom and clarity. In this exploration, we'll examine the nature of this life matrix, how it operates, why it's so difficult to detect, and most importantly, practical approaches to liberating yourself from its constraints. This isn't about adopting new beliefs or following a prescribed path. It's about questioning everything you've been taught to accept as reality and discovering what lies beyond those limitations. The journey out of the matrix begins with a simple but profound question. What if much of what you've accepted as just how life is actually a constructed reality that can be transcended? What possibilities might open up when you step beyond these invisible boundaries? Let's find out. Chapter 1. Understanding your prison. The components of the life matrix. Before you can escape any prison, you must first understand its structure. The matrix that constrains most people's lives isn't a single system, but a complex interweaving of multiple layers of conditioning and limitation. Let's examine the primary components that form this invisible cage, the societal programming layer. From the moment you're born, society begins shaping your perception of reality. This programming isn't a conspiracy, but an inevitable process of cultural transmission that occurs in every human society. The specific content varies across cultures and time periods, but the process is universal. This programming defines what constitutes success, what you should value, how you should behave, and even what you should desire. It establishes normal and creates powerful incentives to conform to these standards. Consider how many of your life goals, career achievements, relationship milestones, material acquisitions, were actually implanted rather than consciously chosen. The most effective aspect of this programming is that it operates largely below conscious awareness. You don't experience these influences as external impositions, but as your own thoughts and desires. When you feel the need to achieve certain status markers or follow particular life paths, these impulses feel entirely self-generated rather than programmed responses. The societal matrix is reinforced through education systems designed primarily for conformity rather than awakening. Media that normalizes certain perspectives while marginalizing others, and social feedback loops that reward compliance and punish deviation. Even rebellion often occurs within parameters defined by the system itself, creating the illusion of freedom while maintaining the fundamental constraints. The psychological conditioning layer. So, deeper than societal programming lies the psychological conditioning unique to your personal history. This layer forms during childhood as you internalize messages from parents, teachers, and significant experiences. These formative influences create core beliefs about yourself and the world that operate as invisible assumptions, shaping your entire life experience. This conditioning creates what psychologists call your internal working model, a set of unconscious expectations about how the world works and how others will respond to you. If you experience conditional love as a child, you likely develop beliefs about needing to perform or achieve to be worthy of acceptance. If you were criticized frequently, you may have internalized a harsh inner critic that continues the pattern decades later. What makes this layer particularly binding is that these conditioned patterns feel like your authentic self rather than imposed limitations. Your fears, insecurities, and self-protective mechanisms seem like inherent aspects of who you are, rather than adaptive responses to past circumstances that no longer apply. This misidentification keeps you trapped in patterns that may have been necessary for childhood survival, but now severely limit your freedom and fulfillment. Into the perceptual limitation layer. Perhaps the most fundamental aspect of the matrix is the inherent limitation of human perception itself. Your sensory organs detect only a tiny fraction of available information in the universe. Your eyes perceive less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. Your ears hear only a narrow range of sound frequencies. Your brain filters the limited information it does receive, constructing a simplified model of reality rather than perceiving things as they actually are. These biological constraints mean that your experience of reality is more like a user interface than direct perception. Just as a computer desktop uses icons to represent complex underlying processes in a way you can interact with, your perception presents a functional but highly limited representation of reality. The problem arises when you mistake this interface for the full reality, like believing the folder icon on your computer screen is actually a physical folder. This perceptual matrix is reinforced by language, which further categorizes and segments experience into discrete concepts that may not reflect reality's true nature. The labels and categories you use to make sense of the world also constrain how you can think about and experience it. As Ludwig Wittgenstein noted, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. The temporal illusion layer. Another crucial component of the life matrix is the way human consciousness relates to time. While you experience time as a linear progression from past to future, with the present as a moving point between them, this perception may be as much a constructed model as your other perceptions. This temporal matrix creates the persistent illusion that fulfillment lies in some future state rather than in the present moment. It generates the feeling that when you achieve the next goal, acquire the next possession, or reach the next milestone, then you'll finally be happy. This perpetual postponement of authentic living keeps you chasing future states while missing the only moment that ever actually exists. Now, the temporal illusion also creates identification with a personal history, a story about who you are based on past experiences, that may severely limit your sense of possibility and freedom in the present. When you believe you are your history, you remain trapped in patterns established by past events rather than responding freshly to current reality. The egoic identity layer. At the core of the matrix lies what many spiritual traditions call the ego, the sense of being a separate self defined by your thoughts, feelings, and experiences. This identification with a mental construct of self is perhaps the most fundamental illusion, creating the sense of separation that drives much of human suffering and limitation. This egoic matrix maintains itself through constant thought, creating an internal narrative that reinforces your separate identity and its concerns. It generates a perpetual sense of incompleteness that keeps you seeking external solutions to an internal sense of lack. It creates the fundamental fear of non-existence that drives much of human behavior, from achievement to conflict. What makes this layer particularly binding is that questioning it feels like questioning your very existence. The ego presents itself as your essential nature rather than a constructed identity, making the prospect of seeing beyond it seem threatening rather than liberating. This self-preservation mechanism of the ego is perhaps the most powerful force maintaining the matrix, the interconnected system. These layers don't operate in isolation, but form an interconnected system that maintains itself through multiple reinforcing mechanisms. Societal programming leverages psychological conditioning, which is enabled by perceptual limitations, all operating within the temporal illusion and serving the maintenance of egoic identity. Understanding these components is the first step toward freedom. By recognizing the constructed nature of what you've accepted as reality, you create the possibility of seeing beyond these limitations. As in the film The Matrix, the most difficult step isn't escaping the system, but recognizing that you're in it in the first place. Chapter 2. Signs you're living in the matrix. How do you know if you're caught in the life matrix? Unlike the dramatic awakening in the film, recognition of your confined state typically comes through subtle signs and persistent feelings that something isn't quite right. Here are the key indicators that you may be living in a constructed reality rather than experiencing life directly. The persistent sense of something missing. One of the most common signs of matrix living is a background feeling that something essential is missing from your life, even when external circumstances are favorable. You might have achieved conventional success, career advancement, financial stability, relationship milestones, yet still feel a puzzling emptiness or lack of fulfillment. This sensation often manifests as a vague restlessness or a feeling that there must be more to life than this. You might find yourself thinking that once you reach the next achievement or acquire the next possession, you'll finally feel complete. Yet each accomplishment brings only temporary satisfaction before the sense of something missing returns. This feeling isn't a personal failing, but a natural response to living within a constructed reality that doesn't address your deeper needs for meaning, authentic connection, and spiritual fulfillment. It's your authentic self signaling that the matrix-defined version of success doesn't align with your true nature. Circular patterns and repetitive struggles. Another clear indicator is finding yourself caught in repetitive patterns despite your best efforts to change. You might notice that you keep encountering the same relationship problems with different partners, facing similar challenges in successive jobs, or repeatedly setting goals that you either don't achieve or that don't bring satisfaction when you do. These patterns aren't coincidental, but reflect the programmed responses you're running within the matrix. Like a character in a video game who can only perform the actions their programming allows, you may be attempting to solve problems using the same level of consciousness that created them. The matrix maintains itself partly through these circular patterns, keeping you engaged in familiar struggles rather than questioning the fundamental assumptions that generate them. Real change requires stepping outside these loops to see the larger pattern, something the matrix-bound consciousness struggles to do. The constant need for distraction. A telling sign of matrix living is difficulty being present without distraction or stimulation. You might notice an almost reflexive reach for your phone when alone, a need to keep the television on for background noise, or discomfort with silence and stillness. This aversion to presence isn't random, but a feature of matrix consciousness. Quieting the constant input allows space for deeper awareness to emerge, awareness that might begin to question the constructed nature of your reality. The matrix maintains itself partly through keeping your attention captured by its content, rather than allowing you to notice the container itself. The intensity of this need for distraction has increased dramatically in recent decades with the proliferation of digital technology. The average person now checks their phone 96 times daily, approximately once every 10 minutes of waking life, creating unprecedented continuous engagement with matrix-reinforcing content. Emotional reactivity and triggered responses. Finding yourself frequently triggered into emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to current circumstances suggests you're operating from matrix programming rather than responding freshly to present reality. These reactions typically follow predictable patterns and often resemble responses from earlier in your life, particularly childhood. In these moments, you're not seeing the actual person or situation before you, but projecting matrix-generated content onto your experience. Your reaction isn't to what's happening now, but to what similar situations meant within your conditioning. This projection mechanism keeps you engaged with the content of your programming, rather than perceiving reality directly. The matrix particularly maintains itself through emotional triggering around core identity issues. Notice how differently you respond to the same information when it challenges versus confirms your existing beliefs. This selective reactivity isn't rational, but a self-protection mechanism of your constructed identity. The dominance of should-based thinking. Matrix living is characterized by a mind filled with shoulds, internal rules about how you and others ought to behave, what you should want or value, and how life should unfold. These imperatives rarely arise from your authentic discernment, but are internalized from external sources. You might notice thoughts like, I should be further along in my career by now. I should want to settle down, or I shouldn't feel this way. These shoulds create constant internal pressure and conflict as your authentic impulses clash with programmed expectations. What makes should-based thinking particularly binding is that these imperatives feel like your own values rather than imposed standards. The matrix operates most effectively when you believe you've chosen the very constraints that limit you. Measuring life through comparison. A clear indicator of matrix consciousness is the habit of evaluating your life primarily through comparison to others. You might find yourself feeling alternatively superior or inferior based on how your achievements, possessions, appearance, or status compare to those around you or to idealized standards. This comparative mindset isn't natural but programmed. It keeps you focused on external metrics rather than internal fulfillment, constantly adjusting your self-worth based on relative position within matrix-defined hierarchies. It creates a perpetual sense of insecurity, as there's always someone who appears to be doing better by some measure. The social media era has intensified this aspect of the matrix, creating unprecedented opportunities for comparison against selectively presented versions of others' lives. The resulting dissatisfaction isn't a bug, but a feature of the system, driving continued striving within matrix parameters. Fear-based decision-making. Perhaps the most limiting aspect of matrix living is making important life choices primarily from fear rather than inspiration or authentic desire. You might stay in unfulfilling relationships or careers because of fear of uncertainty, avoid expressing your true thoughts due to fear of judgment, or pursue safe paths rather than following genuine passions. This fear-based orientation isn't your natural state, but a programmed response that maintains the status quo. The matrix perpetuates itself by making the familiar feel safe and the unknown feel threatening, even when the familiar is limiting your growth and potential fulfillment. Notice how often your decisions are motivated more by avoiding what you don't want than by moving toward what genuinely calls to you. This defensive posture is characteristic of matrix consciousness, which is oriented toward survival within the system rather than thriving beyond it. The feeling of living someone else's life. A profound sign of matrix entrapment is the periodic recognition that the life you're living doesn't feel fully yours, as if you're following a script written by someone else. You might have moments of wondering how you ended up on your current path, or feeling that your choices have been more about meeting external expectations than following your authentic desires. This disconnection often becomes apparent at major life transitions or during quiet moments of reflection. You might realize that your career choice was influenced more by parental expectations than personal passion, or that your lifestyle reflects social norms rather than your own values. These moments of recognition are actually opportunities, cracks in the matrix where greater awareness can enter. They represent your authentic self momentarily perceiving the constructed nature of the life you've been living. Recognizing these signs in your own experience isn't cause for despair, but for hope. Awareness of the matrix is the essential first step toward freedom from it. As you begin to see the patterns and programming that have shaped your perception and choices, you create the possibility of choosing differently, not just making different choices within the same framework, but stepping into a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself. Chapter 3. Why escape is so difficult. If the matrix of conditioned reality is so limiting, why don't more people break free? The answer lies in understanding the powerful forces that maintain this system and resist attempts to transcend it. These aren't external conspiracies, but built-in mechanisms that operate both collectively and within your own mind. The comfort of familiarity. Perhaps the most fundamental force keeping people matrix-bound is the deep psychological preference for the familiar over the unknown. Even when your current reality is limiting or painful, it has the significant advantage of being predictable. Your neural pathways are established, your expectations are set, and you know how to navigate the parameters of your conditioned world. Stepping beyond the matrix requires venturing into unknown territory, not just externally, but in your very sense of self and reality. This prospect triggers deep survival-oriented fear responses that evolved to keep humans safe in physically dangerous environments, but now serve to maintain psychological confinement. This comfort mechanism operates largely below conscious awareness. You don't experience it as a choice to remain limited, but as a natural aversion to the discomfort of uncertainty. The matrix feels like home, while liberation feels like homelessness, a disorienting state without the familiar reference points that have defined your reality, social reinforcement and isolation. The matrix isn't an individual construct, but a collective one, maintained through shared agreement and mutual reinforcement. When you begin questioning fundamental assumptions or living in ways that challenge matrix norms, you often face subtle or overt social consequences designed to bring you back into alignment. These consequences range from concerned questioning by loved ones to outright rejection or ridicule from broader social circles. The implied or explicit message is clear. Conformity is rewarded with belonging, while deviation risks isolation. Given that humans evolved as social creatures with survival depending on group inclusion, these social pressures tap into deep instinctual fears. What makes this mechanism particularly effective is that it's not orchestrated but emergent. People naturally work to maintain shared reality frameworks because divergent perspectives threaten the stability of their own worldviews. Your awakening creates cognitive dissonance for those still fully immersed in the matrix, generating resistance that isn't malicious but self-protective. The ego's survival mechanism. At the individual level, the most powerful force maintaining the matrix is the ego's self-preservation instinct. Your sense of separate self, the I that you typically identify as, is itself a matrix construction, a mental model rather than your fundamental nature. This constructed self maintains itself through continuous thought, emotional attachment to its story, and identification with its attributes and experiences. When you begin to see beyond the matrix, you inevitably start to question this egoic identity, which the mind experiences as an existential threat. The ego doesn't distinguish between psychological death and physical death. Both register as survival threats that trigger powerful resistance mechanisms. This resistance manifests as intensified mental activity when you attempt practices like meditation, sudden emotional upheavals when approaching breakthrough insights, or the mind finding increasingly sophisticated reasons why awakening isn't necessary or possible right now. The ego will co-opt even spiritual seeking into another form of self-maintenance if possible. The investment fallacy. Another significant barrier to liberation is the psychological investment you've made in your matrix-defined identity and life path. You've likely spent decades building your current reality, developing specific skills, establishing a career, creating relationships, and accumulating knowledge and possessions that reflect your conditioned values. The prospect of recognizing that much of this investment served a limited self-concept rather than your authentic unfolding triggers what economists call the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue a behavior based on previously invested resources rather than actual current value. The thought of having been wrong or having wasted time creates powerful resistance to seeing beyond your constructed reality. Why? This investment mechanism often manifests as defensiveness when your beliefs are challenged or as rationalization choices that don't actually bring fulfillment. The greater your investment in matrix-defined success, the stronger this resistance typically becomes. The responsibility paradox. Liberation from the matrix comes with a paradoxical burden, increased responsibility for creating your experience. While matrix living is limiting, it offers the comfort of external causation. You can attribute your unhappiness to circumstances, other people, or society at large. There's a certain relief in believing that your limitations are imposed rather than chosen. Awakening reveals that while conditioning and circumstances are real influences, your response to them remains your choice and responsibility. This recognition is both empowering and demanding. It means you can no longer outsource responsibility for your experience to external factors. Many people unconsciously prefer the limitations of matrix living to the responsibility of conscious creation. This resistance often appears as finding reasons why change isn't possible right now, or focusing on all the external factors that need to shift before you can be free. The matrix mind excels at creating convincing narratives about why liberation must wait for different circumstances. The pleasure-pain mechanism. The matrix maintains itself through a sophisticated system of rewards and punishments that shape behavior without requiring conscious awareness. Matrix-compliant behaviors trigger dopamine releases and social approval, creating pleasure that reinforces continued conformity. Deviation from programmed patterns generates various forms of discomfort, from subtle anxiety to acute emotional pain. This conditioning begins in childhood and continues throughout life, creating neural pathways that automatically seek certain experiences and avoid others based not on their contribution to authentic fulfillment, but on their alignment with matrix programming. Breaking free requires willingness to experience the discomfort of disrupting these established patterns while foregoing familiar pleasures that may actually limit your freedom. The challenge is particularly difficult because the matrix has co-opted natural human drives for connection, security, and validation, and redirected them toward matrix-maintaining behaviors. Distinguishing between authentic needs and programmed desires requires a level of discernment that develops only through the awakening process itself. The perception-reality loop. Perhaps the most fundamental mechanism maintaining the matrix is the self-reinforcing nature of perception itself. Your brain doesn't passively receive information, but actively constructs your experience based on existing neural patterns, expectations, and beliefs. This means that your perception is literally shaped by your programming, creating a closed loop that confirms its own assumptions. This perceptual filtering happens automatically and preconsciously. You don't decide what to notice or how to interpret it, but these processes occur based on established patterns before conscious awareness arises. The result is that your experience continuously confirms your existing worldview not because reality matches your beliefs, but because your perception filters reality to fit them. Breaking this loop requires recognizing that your most basic perceptions, what you notice, what seems important, what feels true, are themselves products of conditioning rather than objective responses to reality. This recognition creates a fundamental disorientation that many find too threatening to sustain, pulling them back into the familiar comfort of matrix perception. The awakening paradox. A final barrier to liberation is what might be called the awakening paradox. The very self that seeks freedom is itself part of the matrix. Your desire for awakening, your concepts about what liberation means, and your strategies for achieving it all emerge from the same conditioned mind that constitutes your limitation. This creates a situation where the matrix-bound self attempts to transcend itself using tools and approaches that reinforce its fundamental assumptions. It's like trying to escape a room by drawing a door on the wall. The activity might feel productive, but it doesn't address the actual nature of confinement. True liberation requires something more radical than the matrix self improving itself or achieving its goals. It requires recognizing that the seeker itself is part of what must be seen through. This paradox creates a fundamental challenge that conventional approaches to personal development often miss entirely. Are themselves products of conditioning rather than objective responses to reality. This recognition creates a fundamental disorientation that many find too threatening to sustain, pulling them back into the familiar comfort of matrix perception. The awakening paradox. A final barrier to liberation is what might be called the awakening paradox. The very self that seeks freedom is itself part of the matrix. Your desire for awakening, your concepts about what liberation means, and your strategies for achieving it all emerge from the same conditioned mind that constitutes your limitation. This creates a situation where the matrix-bound self attempts to transcend itself using tools and approaches that reinforce its fundamental assumptions. It's like trying to escape a room by drawing a door on the wall. The activity might feel productive, but it doesn't address the actual nature of confinement. True liberation requires something more radical than the matrix self improving itself or achieving its goals. It requires recognizing that the seeker itself is part of what must be seen through. This paradox creates a fundamental challenge that conventional approaches to personal development often miss entirely. Understanding these barriers isn't cause for discouragement, but for compassion, both for yourself and for others who remain matrix-bound. These mechanisms aren't personal failings, but universal aspects of the human condition. Recognizing them clearly is itself a step toward freedom, as it allows you to work skillfully with these forces rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. Chapter 4. The Red Pill Practices for Seeing Through the Illusion. In the Matrix, Neo's journey to freedom begins with taking the red pill, a symbol for choosing to see reality as it is, rather than continuing to live within illusion. Your own liberation similarly begins with practices that allow you to perceive beyond your conditioned patterns and recognize the constructed nature of your reality. These approaches serve as your red pill, initiating the process of awakening. Meditation, the foundation of seeing clearly. The most fundamental practice for matrix transcendence is meditation, not as a relaxation technique or focus exercise, but as a systematic method for observing how your mind constructs reality. Through regular meditation, you develop the capacity to witness your thoughts, emotions, and sensations rather than being completely identified with them. This witnessing perspective is revolutionary because it creates separation between your awareness and the content of your consciousness. From this vantage point, you can begin to recognize that thoughts aren't facts but mental events. Emotions aren't commands but energy movements. And sensations aren't solid reality but changing experiences. This recognition loosens the grip of matrix identification. The practice begins simply. Set aside time daily to sit quietly and observe your experience without trying to change it. Notice thoughts arising and passing, emotions flowing, and sensations changing. When you find yourself caught in a thought stream, gently return to witnessing. This isn't about achieving a particular state, but about developing capacity to see how your mind operates. As this practice deepens, you'll begin to notice the patterns that constitute your particular matrix, recurring thoughts, emotional reactions, and physical responses that have been running automatically. You'll see how these patterns create your sense of self and reality, often without any conscious choice on your part. This seeing is itself the beginning of freedom. Pattern interruption, disrupting the automatic matrix. While meditation develops the capacity to see your patterns, pattern interruption practices actively disrupt them, creating spaces where new awareness can enter. These approaches deliberately break habitual sequences of thought, emotion, and behavior that maintain your matrix experience. Simple pattern interruptions include changing your daily routines, taking a different route to work, rearranging your living space, or altering the sequence of your morning activities. More significant interruptions might involve temporary digital detoxes, silent retreats, or travel to unfamiliar cultures where your normal reference points don't apply. The purpose isn't the specific change, but the disruption of automaticity. When your patterns are interrupted, you're temporarily freed from their grip, creating an opportunity to see more clearly. Notice how differently you perceive familiar environments after returning from travel, or how your thought patterns shift during a day of silence. These glimpses beyond your normal matrix experience build the recognition that your reality is more flexible than it appears, questioning core assumptions, dismantling the matrix framework. The matrix maintains itself through unexamined assumptions that you've accepted as reality. Systematic questioning of these assumptions is a powerful practice for seeing through the illusion. This isn't intellectual debate, but genuine inquiry into the foundations of your worldview. Begin with fundamental questions. Who would I be without my story about myself? How do I know what I believe is true? What am I taking for granted about how life works? What if the opposite of my deepest convictions were actually true? These questions aren't meant to reach definitive answers, but to loosen the grip of certainty that maintains matrix perception. The practice of the work, developed by Byron Katie, offers a structured approach to this questioning. When you find yourself suffering from a belief, ask 4 questions. Is it true? Can I absolutely know it's true? How do I react when I believe this thought? Who would I be without this thought? Then turn the thought around to its opposite and find genuine examples of how the turnaround might be as true or truer than the original belief. This questioning practice gradually reveals how much of what you've accepted as objective reality is actually interpretation, assumption, and conditioned response. As these foundations of the matrix become visible, your perception naturally begins to shift toward greater clarity and freedom. Body-based awareness. Bypassing the matrix mind. The matrix operates primarily through thought, the endless stream of mental content that occupies most of your attention. Body-based awareness practices bypass this mental layer, connecting you directly with present experience in ways the conceptual mind cannot filter or control. Practices like yoga, tai chi, authentic movement, or simple body scanning develop your capacity to feel sensations directly rather than through the lens of mental interpretation. This direct sensing reveals a dimension of experience that exists prior to matrix construction, the immediate changing flow of physical reality before thought categorizes and evaluates it. Particularly powerful are practices that bring awareness to the subtle energy body, the felt sense of aliveness that animates your physical form. By attending to this energy directly, you access an aspect of yourself that exists beyond matrix conditioning, providing both a refuge from mental construction and a reference point for what lies beyond it. As body awareness develops, you'll notice how physical sensations often precede and trigger thought patterns, revealing the embodied nature of your conditioning. This recognition allows you to work with matrix patterns at their source, rather than just at the level of conscious thought. Perspective. Shifting, seeing through multiple lenses. The matrix maintains itself partly through the illusion that your perspective is reality, rather than one possible interpretation among many. Deliberate perspective-shifting practices reveal the constructed nature of your viewpoint, loosening its grip on your perception. One approach involves consciously adopting different perspectives on situations that trigger strong reactions. If you're angry with someone, genuinely imagine the situation from their viewpoint, from the perspective of a neutral observer, from how you might see it 20 years in the future, or from the vantage point of a different culture with different values. Another powerful practice is considering how different aspects of yourself perceive the same situation. How does the part of you that values security see this challenge compared to the part that values growth? How does your 5-year-old self perceive this relationship issue compared to your wisest self? These shifts reveal that even within your own consciousness, multiple perspectives exist simultaneously. As you develop this flexibility, you'll recognize that no single perspective captures the full reality of any situation. This recognition frees you from the matrix trap of mistaking your conditioned viewpoint for objective truth, opening space for more conscious choice about which perspectives serve your awakening. Conscious relationship. Mirrors of the matrix. Relationships provide some of the most powerful opportunities for seeing beyond the matrix, because they constantly reflect your conditioning in ways that self-reflection alone might miss. By approaching key relationships as opportunities for awakening, rather than just sources of fulfillment or challenge, you gain invaluable insights into your matrix patterns. The practice involves bringing conscious awareness to your reactions within relationships, particularly when you feel triggered. Rather than focusing exclusively on the other person's behavior, attend to your own response. What exactly am I feeling? What story am I telling about what this means? What past experiences does this remind me of? What part of myself am I seeing reflected in this interaction? This inquiry reveals how much of your relationship experience is projection rather than perception. You're reacting not to the actual person before you, but to matrix-generated content that their behavior has triggered. As you recognize these projections, you can begin to relate more directly to others rather than to your mental constructs about them. Particularly valuable are relationships with others who are also committed to awakening, creating a field of mutual support for seeing beyond conditioning. In these connections, you can explicitly agree to help each other recognize matrix patterns, providing external perspective when you're caught in automatic responses. Nature immersion, beyond human construction. The matrix is largely a human construction, maintained through social agreement and mental activity. Nature exists prior to and independent of these human patterns, offering a direct connection to reality beyond the matrix. Immersion in natural settings can temporarily free you from matrix influences, providing both relief and perspective. The practice involves spending time in natural environments with minimal human intervention, bringing full attention to the sensory experience rather than to your thoughts about it. Notice the sights, sounds, smells, and textures directly without naming or categorizing them. Feel the air on your skin, the ground beneath you, and the space around you without filtering these sensations through conceptual understanding. This direct nature connection reveals a world operating according to principles entirely different from human social constructions. It shows reality functioning perfectly without the narratives, judgments, and categories that dominate matrix consciousness. This perspective helps you recognize how much of your normal experience is overlay rather than reality itself. Extended nature immersion, multiple days in wilderness settings, can be particularly powerful for matrix disruption as it allows the constant mental chatter to gradually subside, revealing the background awareness that exists prior to thought. Many people report profound shifts in perception after such experiences, gaining clarity about matrix patterns that weren't visible within normal environments. Creative expression. Channeling beyond the matrix. Creative practices offer unique pathways beyond matrix limitations because they can access aspects of consciousness that logical thought cannot reach. Through non-analytical creative expression, you can bypass the matrix mind and allow something deeper to emerge. Approaches like free writing, intuitive painting, spontaneous movement, or improvisational music create conditions where the controlling, matrix-bound self temporarily steps aside, allowing expression that doesn't originate from conditioned patterns. The key is engaging without planning or judging, letting the expression flow without knowing in advance what will emerge. This practice isn't about creating art for others' consumption, but about using creative processes as channels for awareness beyond your normal identity. Notice what emerges when you create without the constraints of expectation or evaluation. Pay attention to insights, images, or expressions that surprise you. These often represent aspects of consciousness not contained within your matrix programming. As this practice develops, creative expression becomes not just a temporary escape from matrix thinking, but a regular channel for wisdom beyond it, gradually expanding your access to dimensions of yourself that exist prior to and independent of conditioning. And in dream work, accessing the deeper mind, dreams provide direct access to aspects of consciousness that operate beyond your waking matrix identity. While sleeping, the censoring functions of the conscious mind relax, allowing material from deeper levels to emerge in symbolic form. Working with these dreams can reveal matrix patterns and point toward what lies beyond them. The practice begins with simply remembering dreams by keeping a journal beside your bed and recording dreams immediately upon waking, before the matrix mind fully reactivates. Over time, this builds your connection to dream consciousness and improves recall. As you collect dreams, look for recurring themes, emotions, or symbols that might reflect matrix patterns operating below conscious awareness. Pay particular attention to dreams that feel especially charged or significant. These often contain important messages from aspects of yourself that your waking identity doesn't normally access. Advanced dream work might include lucid dreaming, becoming conscious within the dream state, which allows direct exploration of how your mind constructs reality. This experience can transfer to waking life, helping you recognize the similarly constructed nature of your daily experience. Plant medicine and psychedelics, temporary matrix, dissolution. Some of the most powerful tools for seeing beyond the matrix are certain plant medicines and psychedelics that temporarily disrupt normal consciousness, allowing direct perception of reality without usual filters. Substances like psilocybin, ayahuasca, and LSD can occasion experiences where the matrix becomes visible as a construction rather than being mistaken for reality itself. These approaches require careful consideration, appropriate guidance, and proper setting, as they can be disorienting and challenging. They aren't necessary for awakening and aren't appropriate for everyone. However, research increasingly confirms their potential for facilitating profound shifts in perspective when used thoughtfully. The value isn't in the temporary experience itself, but in the lasting recognition it can catalyze. The understanding that your normal perception is one particular state of consciousness rather than objective reality. This recognition often persists after the substance has cleared your system, providing a reference point for what lies beyond matrix perception. For those who choose this path, integration practices are essential. Structured reflection, journaling, and discussion with knowledgeable guides to incorporate insights from these experiences into daily awareness, rather than treating them as separate from normal life. The practice of presence, the ultimate red pill. Underlying all these approaches is the fundamental practice of presence, bringing full attention to your immediate experience without being absorbed in thought about the past or future. This simple but profound shift from living in mental constructs to direct experience is the essence of matrix transcendence. The practice involves continuously returning attention to the present moment whenever you notice yourself caught in thought. This isn't about stopping thinking, but about changing your relationship to thought, recognizing thoughts as events occurring in awareness rather than reality itself. Presence can be cultivated in any situation, while washing dishes, during conversations, when walking, or even in challenging circumstances. The key is noticing when you've drifted into matrix thinking and gently returning to direct experience, the sensations, sounds, and sights of this moment without the overlay of interpretation. As presence deepens, you'll experience periods where the matrix temporarily falls away completely, revealing reality as it is prior to conceptual understanding. These glimpses beyond the constructed self and world provide direct recognition of what awakening points toward, not a better version of matrix living, but a fundamentally different relationship to experience itself. These practices aren't about accumulating knowledge or achieving particular states, but about seeing through the illusion that has been mistaken for reality. Like Neo's red pill, they initiate a process of recognition that cannot be reversed once begun. The matrix doesn't disappear immediately, but once seen as a construction, it can never again be experienced with the same sense of solidity and inevitability that once characterized it. Chapter 5. Navigating the Awakening Process. Once you've begun to see through the matrix, you enter a process of awakening that unfolds according to its own timeline and rhythm. This journey isn't linear but cyclical, with periods of clarity and confusion, expansion and contraction, insight and integration. Understanding the typical patterns of this process helps you navigate it more skillfully, avoiding common pitfalls and unnecessary suffering. The disorientation phase. When reality shifts, the initial phase of awakening often involves significant disorientation as your familiar reference points begin to dissolve. What you previously accepted as solid reality starts to appear constructed, and the identity you've taken for granted reveals itself as a collection of patterns rather than your essential nature. This disorientation can manifest as anxiety, confusion, or even fear as the mind struggles to maintain its familiar frameworks, while new perception undermines them. You might experience mood swings, sleep disruptions, or difficulty concentrating as your system adjusts to seeing beyond its conditioning. The key to navigating this phase is understanding that disorientation is normal and necessary, not a sign that something is wrong, but that something is right. The discomfort comes not from the awakening itself, but from resistance to it, as the matrix-bound aspects of your mind attempt to reassert familiar patterns. During this phase, simplify external commitments when possible, establish supportive daily routines, and practice self-compassion for the challenges of this transition. Remember that you're undergoing a fundamental reorganization of your relationship to reality, a process that naturally creates temporary instability before establishing a new, more authentic equilibrium. The deconstruction process, dismantling the false. As awakening progresses, you'll experience the systematic deconstruction of beliefs, identities, and attachments that have constituted your matrix reality. This isn't something you need to force. Once the seeing has begun, the dismantling occurs naturally as false structures can no longer maintain themselves in the light of awareness. This deconstruction often proceeds layer by layer, beginning with more superficial beliefs and gradually reaching core identities. You might first recognize the constructed nature of social roles you've adopted, then see through more personal identifications with achievements or relationships, and eventually question the most fundamental sense of being a separate self. Each layer of deconstruction may bring both liberation and loss, freedom from limitations you didn't know were optional, but also grief for identities and certainties you've invested in and valued. This combination of release and mourning creates the emotional intensity that often characterizes awakening. The skillful approach isn't to rush this process or to cling to dissolving structures, but to allow the deconstruction to unfold at its own pace while maintaining awareness of what's happening. Notice the mind's attempts to rebuild matrix patterns even as they're being seen through, and hold these attempts with compassionate understanding rather than judgment. The void experience, between worlds. Many awakening journeys include periods of the void, experiences where old matrix structures have dissolved but new, more authentic ways of being haven't yet stabilized. These void phases can feel like emptiness, meaninglessness, or being lost between worlds, neither fully in the matrix nor fully beyond it. The void often triggers fear because the ego interprets this emptiness as death or non-existence, rather than as the space of possibility that precedes new emergence. The matrix-bound mind cannot conceive of existence beyond its structures, and so perceives their absence as nothingness rather than freedom. This phase requires particular trust and patience. The tendency is to rush back into familiar patterns or to grasp at new spiritual identities to escape the discomfort of groundlessness. Resisting these impulses allows the void to serve its purpose, clearing space for authentic being to emerge without being predetermined by past conditioning. Practices that help navigate the void include simple presence with the experience without labeling or judging it, gentle physical activities that ground awareness in the body, and connecting with others who understand this phase of the journey and can normalize its challenges. The integration challenge, embodying awakening. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the awakening journey is integration, bringing your insights and recognitions into everyday life, rather than maintaining awakening as a separate spiritual experience. This integration involves learning to function effectively in the conventional world while no longer being fully bound by its matrix assumptions. The difficulty arises because awakening doesn't eliminate the practical need to engage with matrix structures. You still need to work, maintain relationships, and navigate social systems that operate according to conventional reality frameworks. The task is to participate in these structures without being defined or limited by them. To be in the world, but not of it, as many traditions express it. Integration often involves periods of oscillation between awakened perception and matrix identification as you learn to stabilize awareness beyond conditioning while still functioning effectively within relative reality. This isn't regression, but part of the natural rhythm of embodying awakening in human form. Practical approaches to integration include regular contemplative practice to maintain connection with awareness beyond the matrix, conscious engagement with daily activities as opportunities for awakened presence, and cultivation of relationships that support your evolving perspective rather than pulling you back into conventional identification. The compassion expansion beyond personal liberation. As awakening deepens, the focus typically shifts from personal liberation to compassionate engagement with the collective matrix. You recognize that all beings are caught in similar conditioning, struggling with the same fundamental confusion about their nature and reality. And this recognition naturally evokes compassion rather than judgment or separation. This compassion isn't based on seeing others as broken or needing to be fixed, but on clear perception of the universal human condition, the shared experience of seeking happiness while being confused about its source. It acknowledges that everyone is doing the best they can from their current level of awareness, even when their behavior appears harmful or limited. This phase often involves finding ways to contribute to others' awakening without imposing your perspective or creating new matrix structures in spiritual disguise. The approach becomes one of creating conditions that support others' natural recognition rather than trying to convince or convert them to particular beliefs. The challenge is maintaining this compassionate engagement without being pulled back into matrix identification yourself, continuing to see the constructed nature of reality while participating lovingly in the human drama. This balance requires ongoing practice and the support of others who share this orientation. The continuing unfoldment. Awakening never ends. A crucial understanding for the awakening journey is that it never reaches a final destination. There is no state of perfect enlightenment after which nothing further unfolds. Awakening is an ongoing process of ever-deepening recognition and embodiment that continues throughout life. This continuing unfoldment occurs because awareness itself is infinite, with no limit to its potential, depth, and clarity. Each recognition creates the conditions for further seeing, each integration opens new dimensions of experience, and each expression of awakened being reveals new possibilities for embodiment. This understanding helps prevent the common trap of spiritual achievement, the matrix mind's attempt to claim awakening as an accomplishment that defines a new, superior identity. True awakening includes recognizing that even spiritual attainment can become another matrix structure if claimed by the separate self. The skillful approach is holding awakening as a verb rather than a noun, an ongoing process of seeing, integrating, and expressing rather than a state to be achieved or maintained. This orientation keeps the journey fresh and alive, rather than solidifying into new forms of spiritual materialism. Common challenges and skillful responses. Several challenges typically arise during the awakening journey, and understanding them helps you respond skillfully rather than being derailed by them. Spiritual bypassing occurs when awakening insights are used to avoid dealing with psychological material or practical life challenges. The response isn't abandoning spiritual practice, but ensuring it includes rather than excludes human development and responsible living. Awakening arrogance emerges when spiritual insights create a sense of superiority to those still fully identified with the matrix. This attitude actually indicates incomplete awakening, as true seeing recognizes the essential equality of all beings, regardless of their current level of awareness. Nihilism or meaninglessness can arise when the constructed nature of meaning systems is recognized without also seeing the authentic purpose. Several challenges typically arise during the response is continuing the journey, and understanding them helps you respond skillfully, discovering the meaning that exists prior to social. Spiritual bypassing occurs when awakening insights are used to avoid dealing with psychological material or practical life challenges. The response isn't abandoning spiritual practice, but ensuring it includes rather than excludes human development and responsible living. Awakening arrogance emerges when spiritual insights create a sense of superiority to those still fully identified with the matrix. This attitude actually indicates incomplete awakening, as true seeing recognizes the essential equality of all beings, regardless of their current level of awareness. Nihilism or meaninglessness can arise when the constructed nature of meaning systems is recognized without also seeing the authentic purpose that emerges beyond conditioning. The response is continuing the journey rather than concluding that nothing matters, discovering the meaning that exists prior to social programming. Spiritual addiction develops when awakening experiences become another form of seeking, pursuing spiritual highs rather than embodying insights in everyday life. The antidote is grounding practice in ordinary experience and recognizing that true awakening includes embracing the mundane as sacred. Relationship disruption often occurs as your perspective shifts while others in your life remain identified with matrix reality. Navigating this requires neither compromising your awakening nor imposing your perspective, but finding authentic ways to connect across different levels of awareness. The awakening journey is both the most challenging and the most rewarding process a human being can undertake. It asks everything of you, all your courage, commitment, and willingness to face the unknown, but offers in return the one thing that matters most, the opportunity to live from your authentic nature rather than from conditioning, to experience reality directly rather than through the veil of matrix illusion. Chapter 6. Living Beyond the Matrix. What does life look like when you're no longer fully identified with the matrix? While each person's expression of awakened living is unique, certain qualities and approaches tend to characterize existence beyond conditioned patterns. Understanding these characteristics provides both inspiration for the journey and practical guidance for embodying your insights. Presence as the foundation. The most fundamental quality of post-matrix living is presence, the capacity to be fully engaged with current experience rather than lost in thought about past or future. This presence isn't an occasional state, but becomes the background of all experience, the space in which life unfolds. This doesn't mean you never think about past or future. Practical functioning requires memory and planning, but that these mental activities occur within awareness rather than absorbing it completely. You can access information from the past or project possibilities into the future without losing connection to present reality. This presence manifests as a natural alertness and aliveness that doesn't require stimulation or entertainment to maintain itself. Ordinary moments, washing dishes, walking to the car, waiting in line, become opportunities for full engagement rather than experiences to rush through or escape via mental distraction. The quality of your experience transforms through this presence. Colors appear more vivid, sensations more immediate, and even challenging emotions more interesting when experienced directly rather than through the filter of conceptual thinking. Life gains a richness and texture that matrix living, with its constant mental commentary, cannot access. Freedom from identity. Fixation. Beyond the matrix, your sense of self becomes fluid rather than fixed, an open, adaptable expression of awareness rather than a rigid identity defined by particular attributes or experiences. You no longer need to maintain a consistent self-image because you recognize that your essential nature exists prior to and independent of any temporary self-concept. This freedom from identity fixation allows you to engage different aspects of yourself as appropriate to each situation without being limited by the need for consistency. You might express assertiveness in one context, receptivity in another, playfulness in a third, all without experiencing these as contradictions or threats to your sense of self. This fluidity extends to how you relate to roles and responsibilities. You can fully engage professional functions, family roles, or social positions without mistaking them for your identity. The roles become expressions of your being rather than definitions of it, allowing both full participation and freedom from limitation. The result is a paradoxical combination of authenticity and freedom. You express your true nature more consistently precisely because you're not identified with any particular expression of it. Your actions arise from present response to actual circumstances rather than from the need to maintain a predetermined self-concept or natural ethics beyond morality. Matrix living typically involves following externally imposed moral codes, rules about right and wrong behavior that you've internalized from family, religion, culture, or other sources. Beyond the matrix, these rigid codes give way to natural ethics that arise from clear seeing and compassionate presence. This ethical sense isn't based on obedience to authority or fear of consequences, but on direct perception of interconnection. When you recognize that all beings are expressions of the same consciousness that you are, harmful behavior becomes obviously counterproductive rather than something you must be talked out of through moral injunctions. This natural ethics often appears more nuanced than conventional morality, responding to the actual circumstances of each situation rather than applying predetermined rules. It may sometimes look unconventional from the outside while arising from deeper wisdom and compassion than rule-based approaches. The shift from imposed morality to natural ethics brings a sense of integrity and alignment that rule-following cannot provide. Your actions flow from your being rather than from should-based thinking, creating internal coherence rather than the fragmentation that comes from forcing behavior that doesn't match your authentic impulses. Effortless manifestation. The matrix operates largely through striving, effortful attempting to make things happen according to your conditioned desires. Beyond the matrix, manifestation becomes more effortless, arising from alignment with deeper currents of being rather than from pushing against perceived resistance. This doesn't mean you never take action or that everything magically appears without engagement. Rather, your actions come from a different place, from inspiration rather than desperation, from creative response rather than reactive pushing, from trust in the unfolding process rather than fear of not getting what you want. Synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that serves your authentic path, becomes more common as you live beyond matrix patterns. Opportunities, resources, and connections appear with a timing and appropriateness that seems orchestrated, though not by the separate self. This isn't magical thinking, but the natural result of perceiving and flowing with currents of possibility that matrix consciousness filters out. The paradox of this effortless manifestation is that it often brings different outcomes than your matrix self would have pursued, yet these turn out to better serve your authentic unfolding. You find yourself creating a life that feels deeply right without matching the templates of success you previously accepted without question. Transparent emotions. In matrix consciousness, emotions often become tangled with identity, creating complex knots of feeling, thought, and self-concept that persist over time. Beyond the matrix, emotions become more transparent, arising clearly in response to current circumstances, expressing themselves fully and passing naturally without leaving residue. This emotional transparency doesn't mean suppressing or transcending feelings, but experiencing them more directly and completely. Sadness, anger, fear, and joy all move through your system without the complications of judgment, story, or identification that characterize matrix emotional patterns. The result is emotional responsiveness without reactivity. You feel fully while maintaining the spaciousness of awareness that prevents being completely identified with any emotional state. This allows both authentic expression and the wisdom to choose how that expression manifests in behavior. This transparency extends to how you relate to others' emotions as well. Rather than taking their feelings personally or feeling responsible for managing their emotional states, you can remain present with their experience without absorption or defense. This creates the conditions for genuine intimacy based on shared presence rather than emotional entanglement. For instance, intuitive knowing. Beyond the matrix, intuitive knowing becomes more accessible and reliable as a guide for decision-making and action. This isn't replacing rational thought, but complementing it with direct perception that doesn't require logical analysis to reach understanding. This intuition operates through multiple channels, as physical sensations that signal alignment or misalignment with potential choices, as spontaneous insights that arise without deliberate reasoning, as symbolic dreams or images that communicate deeper wisdom, or as a quiet inner voice that offers guidance when attended to. The development of this intuitive capacity involves both trusting these signals when they appear and creating the conditions that allow them to emerge more clearly. Regular practices that quiet the analytical mind, connection with natural rhythms that attune you to larger patterns, and cultivation of body awareness that detects subtle signals all support this intuitive knowing. The integration of intuition with rational thinking creates a more comprehensive intelligence than either alone can provide. Rather than abandoning logic, you develop the discernment to recognize which approach, analytical or intuitive, is most appropriate for each situation and how they can work together to inform your choices and actions. Authentic relationships. Matrix relationships are often based on unconscious projections, unspoken expectations, and mutual reinforcement of conditioned patterns. Beyond the matrix, relationships become more authentic, based on seeing others as they are, rather than as projections of your needs and fears, and on sharing presence rather than just activities or interests. This authenticity doesn't mean perfect harmony or absence of challenges. In fact, authentic relationships often involve more direct communication about differences and more willingness to engage conflicts as opportunities for deeper understanding. The difference is that these interactions occur without the drama and persistent resentments that characterize matrix relationship patterns. The capacity for solitude also transforms beyond the matrix. Rather than experiencing aloneness as loneliness to be avoided, you discover the richness of communion with your own being and with the living world around you. This self-sufficiency paradoxically enables more genuine connection with others, as you no longer relate from need or fear of abandonment. Perhaps most significantly, relationships beyond the matrix include conscious connection with non-human beings, animals, plants, landscapes, and the elements. These connections aren't sentimental projections, but direct recognition of shared being across different forms, creating a sense of belonging within the larger web of life that matrix consciousness typically obscures. Creative participation. Beyond the matrix, life itself becomes a creative process in which you participate rather than a series of problems to solve or goals to achieve. This creative orientation isn't limited to conventional artistic expression, but extends to how you approach every dimension of existence. This creativity manifests as improvisation rather than following scripts, responding freshly to each situation rather than applying predetermined formulas or repeating habitual patterns. It involves working with the materials at hand rather than waiting for ideal circumstances, finding possibilities within apparent limitations rather than being stopped by them. The source of this creativity isn't the separate self, but the intelligence of life expressing through your unique form. It arises not from effortful attempting to be original, but from allowing yourself to be a channel for what wants to emerge through you. This often involves getting the conditioned self out of the way rather than trying to make something happen through personal will. This creative participation extends to how you engage with challenges and difficulties. Rather than seeing problems as obstacles to happiness, you recognize them as invitations to creative response, opportunities to manifest solutions that serve not just your individual needs, but the larger systems of which you're part. Embodied spirituality. Matrix spirituality often involves seeking special experiences, accumulating esoteric knowledge, or escaping ordinary reality for transcendent states. Beyond the matrix, spirituality becomes fully embodied, not a separate domain of life, but the ground of all experience, expressed through engaged presence with ordinary reality. This embodiment doesn't mean abandoning the recognition of consciousness beyond form, but experiencing that consciousness as not separate from form itself. The sacred isn't elsewhere, but here, not in the future, but now, not in special circumstances, but in every breath, sensation, and encounter. The spirituality manifests through the body rather than despite it, honoring physical existence as an expression of consciousness rather than an obstacle to it. It includes sexuality as a domain of presence and communion rather than either indulgence or repression. It embraces the messiness and limitations of human experience rather than seeking to transcend them. Perhaps most importantly, this embodied spirituality expresses itself through practical action in the world rather than retreat from it. It recognizes that awakening isn't complete until it manifests as service, not from obligation or self-sacrifice, but as the natural expression of recognizing yourself in all beings and responding to their needs as your own. The paradox of ordinary enlightenment. The ultimate expression of life beyond the matrix involves what might be called ordinary enlightenment, the paradoxical recognition that awakening doesn't lead to special states or extraordinary experiences, but to fully inhabiting the ordinary with extraordinary presence. This ordinariness doesn't mean mediocrity or limitation, but the discovery that what you've been seeking through matrix striving has been present all along in the simple fact of existence itself. The specialness you've pursued through achievement, acquisition, or even spiritual practice reveals itself as the birthright of being, available in each moment of conscious presence. This ordinary enlightenment often looks unremarkable from the outside. You still engage normal human activities, working, relating, resting, playing, but experience them from a fundamentally different place. The difference isn't in what you do, but in how you do it, and from where within yourself the doing arises. The freedom of this ordinary enlightenment isn't freedom from the conditions of human existence, but freedom within them, not escaping limitations, but discovering the limitless awareness that experiences all conditions without being defined by any of them. It's the freedom to be fully human, embracing both the transcendent and immanent dimensions of existence without division or conflict. Living beyond the matrix doesn't guarantee perpetual bliss or perfect circumstances. Challenges, pain, and difficulties continue as part of the human journey. The difference is that these experiences no longer define you or determine your fundamental state. They move through the spaciousness of your being without contracting it, allowing response without reaction, engagement without identification. This is the promise of matrix transcendence. Not escape from life, but full participation in it. Not perfect circumstances, but perfect presence with whatever circumstances arise. Not special status, but the extraordinary gift of ordinary being fully realized and expressed through your unique form. These postponements are the matrix's most effective self-preservation mechanism, keeping the possibility of freedom perpetually in the future, rather than available now. The truth is that awakening can only happen in the present moment, and no circumstance is more or less favorable for the fundamental choice to see beyond illusion. What makes this choice challenging isn't just the matrix resistance, but the fact that it requires surrendering the very identity that appears to be making the choice. The separate self cannot awaken itself. It can only create the conditions that allow awakening to occur through the recognition that awareness, not the conditioned self, is your true nature. This paradox means that awakening involves a kind of surrender that the matrix mind finds threatening rather than appealing. Yet despite these challenges, humans have been making this choice throughout history and across cultures. The awakening journey isn't new, but ancient, documented in wisdom traditions worldwide through different languages and metaphors, but pointing to the same essential recognition. What you are is prior to and greater than the conditioned identity you've taken yourself to be, and direct realization of this truth is available to anyone willing to look beyond appearances. This universality offers both encouragement and guidance. You aren't alone in this journey, even when it feels most solitary. Countless others have walked this path before you, leaving signposts and practices that can help navigate the territory beyond the matrix. While your expression of awakening will be unique to your particular form and circumstances, the fundamental process follows patterns that these traditions have mapped with remarkable consistency. The benefits of choosing awakening extend far beyond personal liberation. As you free yourself from matrix identification, you naturally contribute to the awakening of others, not through proselytizing or imposing your perspective, but through embodying a different way of being that demonstrates the possibility of freedom by example. Your presence itself becomes an invitation for others to recognize what lies beyond their conditioning. This collective dimension becomes increasingly important as humanity faces unprecedented challenges that matrix consciousness has created and cannot resolve. The environmental crises, social divisions, and technological disruptions of our time aren't separate problems to be solved through the same thinking that produced them, but symptoms of a fundamental misperception about the nature of reality and our place within it. Individual awakening contributes to the collective shift in consciousness that these challenges demand. The choice for awakening doesn't require dramatic external changes, quitting your job, leaving your relationships, or moving to a monastery, though such changes might eventually flow from your evolving perspective. It begins simply with the commitment to see clearly, to question what you've accepted as reality, and to prioritize truth over comfort when these come into conflict. This commitment, renewed daily through practice and intention, initiates a process that unfolds according to its own intelligence rather than your matrix-based plans or expectations. The invitation before you now isn't to achieve some final state of enlightenment, but to take the next step on your unique journey beyond the matrix. This might mean establishing a regular meditation practice, seeking guidance from those further along the path, creating space in your life for reflection and inquiry, or simply bringing more presence to your everyday activities. The specific form matters less than the underlying intention to see beyond conditioning into the nature of reality itself. As you contemplate this invitation, remember that the matrix offers no genuine security despite its promises. The certainties it provides are illusory, the identities it offers are temporary, and the fulfillment it dangles always remains just out of reach. True security comes not from controlling matrix conditions, but from recognizing what in you remains unchanged amidst all conditions, the awareness that experiences all states without being defined by any of them. Remember also that awakening isn't about adding something to your current experience, but removing the veil that prevents you from recognizing what's already present. The freedom, peace, and aliveness you seek aren't achievements to be attained through effort, but your natural state when not obscured by matrix identification. The journey is one of subtraction rather than addition, of recognizing rather than becoming. Finally, approach this choice with both courage and compassion. Courage to face the discomfort and disorientation that awakening sometimes involves, and compassion for the aspects of yourself that resist this journey out of fear and habit. The matrix patterns weren't chosen consciously and don't represent failure or weakness, but the natural functioning of human consciousness without the light of awareness. They deserve understanding rather than judgment as they gradually dissolve in the recognition of what lies beyond them. The matrix of conditioned reality has served its purpose in your development, providing structure and orientation when needed. But like the scaffolding that supports a building under construction, it can be recognized as temporary assistance rather than the edifice itself. The time comes to see beyond these supports to the authentic being they've helped to develop but cannot contain. That time is always now, this moment, the only one in which awakening ever occurs. Not after more preparation, not when circumstances change, not when you feel ready, but now in the simple recognition that awareness is already present, already free, already awake beneath the matrix patterns that have seemed so solid and defining. This recognition isn't the end, but the beginning of a life increasingly lived from authenticity rather than conditioning, from presence rather than automaticity, from love rather than fear. It's the beginning of your unique expression of the freedom that is your birthright and the contribution that only you, freed from matrix limitation, can make to a world in profound need of awakened consciousness. The choice is yours, made new in each moment. Will you continue to accept the matrix as reality, or will you commit to seeing what lies beyond it? Everything that matters most depends on your answer. Practical guidance, next steps on the journey. For those ready to take concrete steps beyond matrix living, here are specific practices and approaches to support your journey. Daily meditation. Practice. Establish a consistent daily meditation practice, even if brief. Begin with 10-15 minutes each morning of simply sitting quietly and observing your experience without trying to change it. Notice thoughts, emotions, and sensations arising and passing without becoming absorbed in their content. This basic witnessing practice builds the foundation for all other aspects of awakening. As this practice develops, you might explore structured approaches like mindfulness meditation, self-inquiry, or contemplative practices from wisdom traditions that resonate with you. The specific technique matters less than the regular cultivation of the witnessing capacity that allows you to recognize the difference between awareness itself and the contents appearing within it. Conscious consumption. Become more selective about what you allow into your consciousness through media, conversations, and environments. The matrix maintains itself partly through constant input that reinforces its assumptions and patterns. Creating space from this input through periodic digital detoxes, careful selection of media consumption, and mindful choices about social environments allows different perspectives to emerge. This doesn't mean isolating yourself from the world or consuming only spiritual content, but developing discernment about what serves your awakening and what reinforces matrix identification. Notice how different inputs affect your state of consciousness, and make choices accordingly, rather than passively absorbing whatever your environment presents. Body-based practices. Incorporate practices that develop embodied awareness, helping you ground consciousness in direct experience rather than remaining caught in conceptual thinking. Options include yoga, tai chi, conscious walking, dance, or simply taking regular breaks to feel sensations throughout your body without mental commentary. These approaches are particularly valuable for those whose matrix patterns operate primarily through excessive thinking and analysis. The body provides a direct connection to present reality that the conceptual mind cannot filter or control, offering a pathway beyond matrix perception that complements more cognitive approaches. Nature connection. Spend regular time in natural settings with minimal human intervention, bringing full attention to the sensory experience rather than to thoughts about it. Nature operates according to principles entirely different from human social constructions, providing both relief from matrix influences and perspective on what lies beyond them. Even brief periods in parks, gardens, or wilderness areas can shift your state of consciousness when approached with presence rather than distraction. Extended nature immersion, multiple days in natural settings, can be particularly powerful for disrupting matrix patterns and allowing deeper awareness to emerge. Journaling practice. Maintain a regular journaling practice focused on tracking your awakening journey. This might include recording insights from meditation, documenting matrix patterns as you recognize them, exploring questions that arise about the nature of reality and identity, or expressing experiences that don't fit within conventional understanding. This practice serves multiple purposes. It helps consolidate insights that might otherwise be forgotten, creates a record of your journey that reveals patterns over time, provides an outlet for processing experiences that may be difficult to discuss with others, and develops the capacity for self-reflection essential to the awakening process. Conscious relationship. Cultivate relationships with others